Welcome to the Impact Multiplier CEO podcast. If you're a chief executive, or if you think like one, and you want to create exponentially greater impact, then this show is for you. My name is Richard Medcalf, founder of Xquadrant. I coach some of the most successful and impressive CEOs and executive teams on the planet and help them achieve extraordinary results. And no matter how successful you've been in the past, there's always a whole new level of impact available to you. So, if you're ready to play a bigger game than ever before, I invite you to join us and become an Impact Multiplier CEO. How often do you find yourself in the weeds when preparing a piece of communication, whether it's internally or with customers or investors? Perhaps you find yourself offering fact after fact and perhaps running out of time to actually tie them together. Sometimes you might receive feedback that your communication isn't strategic enough, perhaps it's too long, and so perhaps it's not serving you in the best way. And so today we want to get into the question of how can we get out of the weeds and convey the insights that really add value to the people that we're speaking with, as I say, whether it's customers, staff, or investors. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I have Davina Stanley again with me as usual, and it's episode 4 of season 5 of the podcast, and the subject is from ideas to impact. That's what we're really trying to look at here. And so, Dav, it's great to have you, and looking forward to hearing your wisdom on this topic.
Oh, thanks, Richard. Great to be back again. I always enjoy our conversations.
Well, we were just joking before we started that we always trying to find the chit chat to have as we kind of get into it and to get us into the zone. And we mustn't keep talking about the weather, but I want to keep talking about the weather because it's raining in Sydney and it's actually a lovely spring morning here in Paris. So I think the tides are turning. Right, we're coming out of winter, and you know, you are showing me your phone with all the rain and clouds on the screen.
Yes, we've got a week of rain coming, although I have to say I do choose my weather app according to the weather forecast that I like the best. And this week, there's not much of a choice. It's 90% chance of rain tomorrow, 80% Friday, 100% on Saturday, and then not improving much. It's just rain every day.
I just thought Sydney was this amazing, beach life, and
It
everybody was
is.
just bronzed and, sun from dawn till dusk.
So true.
You're going to be sued by the Sydney Tourist Development Board, I think, for telling everybody the real truth about the coaches.
Story.
Yeah.
Well, somebody said to me when I don't know if I should say this, let's see, when we moved to Sydney, somebody said to me, "Oh, that's all very well if you like rain and cockroaches. That's a bit crude, isn't it? It's terrible." But no, I think what happens in Sydney is when it rains, it really rains, and you get a batch of it, and then it goes away. And even though every day it apparently, according to the weather app, it's going to rain, my observation is that it gets very pessimistic, and then it does ease off. So I've already been out for a walk today for a good hour. I've been outside for a good hour and a half today and had a lovely walk. So down by the water, and it was stunning. So I think it's wow.
So let's get on to ideas to impact. So what are we talking about today, Dav?
We are talking about top-down thinking. And the difference between top-down thinking and top-down hierarchy. I think sometimes people confuse that, and they think of top-down, they think of perhaps somebody at a senior level in an organization talking down to the rest, or feeding ideas, cascading ideas down through an organization. Whereas that's when I think about top-down thinking, I think about it in a very different context. I think about it in terms of the way ideas are arranged. Particularly when communicating, but also within a piece of communication, but also when solving problems. I think of it in both of those settings, although we're talking particularly about the communication aspect of that in the conversations we've been having here. So,
so we're going to look at how does top-down thinking help us, right, in communicating ideas with impact. So,
exactly.
So where do we go? How do you want to take this? What's the format?
Well, I think there are three things that I'd love to cover off on. And firstly, I thought it'd help just to talk a bit more about what top-down thinking means and what that's all about, because some people will know, but I think some people won't. It's quite a foreign concept to a lot of people. And secondly, just give you some techniques for helping you create perspective and direction. And that's really about looking from the top down, but then also thinking about, well, how can you bob up and down through the details? So it's one thing to know what it is, it's one thing to know how to actually look top down, but then it's another to say, well, how do we then come bottom up? How do we do both of those things which we need to do? How do we bob up and down through our thinking hierarchy to create something really powerful?
Okay, well, let's jump in. So top-down thinking. So I guess I've got my view on what that is, but tell me, what's your definition? What's top-down thinking, and how does it differ from, I guess it might be bottom-up thinking?
Yeah, I use both of those things together. And so top-down thinking is where you start with the big picture and then you work down into the details. And so when you're crafting a piece of communication, you might start with some high-level concepts and then fill them in with the detail. And bottom-up thinking is when you start with the detail and tie them together and synthesize them up. So layer by layer, perhaps up towards the top of the hierarchy. And those two techniques, I think, come together, or two concepts come together quite beautifully when preparing communication. And it's a concept that I learned a lot about, I guess, when I was in management consulting. But there were two sort of pivotal points for me in my career, which has sort of stuck with me all along, that is I think really helped me use these ideas and or motivate me more. So firstly was an example when way before I joined McKinsey, before I knew what management consulting was, I remember working with somebody who was my boss, and he was the head of corporate affairs at a chemical company. And we were sitting in a meeting with the team, and he just got to the whiteboard and he drew this picture which really captured the essence of this really complicated concept that he wanted us all to understand. And I remember my breath being taken away, thinking, wow, I've never seen anybody do that before. And I was in my early 20s, I was young. And so I'd never seen anything like that before. I thought that was just so clever. And I thought, my gosh, I wonder how on earth he does that. I want to be able to do that. That is so cool. And so that was that sort of one memory that I have that was quite formative and I suppose inspiring, and, just sort of parked it away to think, gosh, how do you do that? And then, fast forward a few years, and I was in my first team meeting when I was at McKinsey, and in my role, I was helping consultants, and I was then, in this instance, was my first time being staffed to a team, to a consulting team. And that was quite a big deal to be able to do that. And so I was there and I'd done all my analysis for the communication strategy that we thought this client needed to develop. And I had screeds and screeds of tables of, in these settings, these people need this information, and I'd color coded, and it was magnificent, right? And it had taken quite some time to prepare and was terribly thorough. And I remember, and I will never forget the fellow's face, sitting down with my team, proud as punch, just never having been in one of these team meetings before. I'd done all the training, but hadn't been in one of these meetings before. And so he just asked me, so, what was my update? And I started talking through all the detail that I had, all of the research I'd done. And he just cut me dead, that wasn't what he wanted at all. He wanted to know what all that meant, and maybe one page and what the plan was. And I was just, oh my gosh, how do I get out of all this detail and get to that high level? So I think, those two very contrasting memories have been quite powerful for me, because they've just given me that experience of, oh, it's a great idea to do that top-down thing, but gee whiz, how do you actually do it? And I think, when you're in that position and you feel that discomfort, the pain doesn't go away very quickly. That was many years ago now. I can still remember it.
So what's the takeaway from this, right? So there's these two different ways in the light bulb. How do we apply that?
How do you apply it? So I think, firstly, work top down first of all. So whenever you're preparing a piece of communication, have a structure that you can use. And we use a thing called a storyline, where you have a really short introduction, a single idea, and then supporting points underneath. So we draw it like a tree. But before we get to thinking about what actually goes on the page, the first thing we do is say, right, well, what's our purpose? What do we actually want to achieve here? So, you know, as a result of this communication, I want my audience to know, think, or do what. Get very, very clear about that. And then think, well, who is my audience? And really understand that and understand where they're coming from and what their issues are, and take some time to work that out. Now, the reasons we do that is so that we can work out, you know, the sorts of things we need to convey.
I just want to say on that kind of the key outcome, it's quite interesting. I spoke with somebody yesterday who was wanting to communicate with their chief executive, in fact, and I asked what their outcome, you know, what they really wanted to communicate, and actually they kind of got it a bit off. I think you're like, well, I want to kind of like I want to align around, you know, our productivity approach. Okay, and so I was like, well, that's kind of like that's the outcome, kind of, but what do you actually want to communicate to generate that outcome? So what's the one thing you want them to remember from the communication?
Yes.
So I think, you know, there is the kind of the final outcome, but then there is what's the one nugget that you want them to have, which is most likely to generate that outcome. And
Correct.
That's where we moved from this kind of, oh yeah, it's not about alignment, it's about them understanding this. And then that became much more tangible and concrete.
Yes, and I think moving from the abstract to the concrete is really important. And thinking about that purpose statement, you know, it was a bit of a light bulb for a client of mine last week, actually, where, you know, they had prepared a story that just missed the point completely, and partly because they'd tried to write that purpose statement into the document and make that the message. And I said, but actually, that's what you want to achieve as a result of your communication. That's not what's going to actually achieve that outcome. We need to think about what message will achieve that outcome.
Right.
And they were quite at odds, and they were working in politics too. So there's, you know, quite a lot of subtlety and nuance required to achieve that outcome. And that's, I guess, part of the journey of really understanding your audience and getting very, very good at, you know, finding out what their issues are and what matters to them.
So we'll explore my little case study in a second, but before we go on to the next your next point, so we've got this kind of understanding of what top-down thinking is. So then, what does that help with?
Then, okay, so I think firstly, in a practical sense, once you've clarified what we call the strategy, so your purpose and audience, and then that helps give you the sort of cannon fodder, if you like, to build the story and work out what sorts of things need to go in your story that you map out in a pretty structured sort of a way. You know, that's great. But you can start with your top-down architecture and do that quite early. And so when we're thinking about bobbing up and down between the hierarchy, I think this is where we start to get practical. So step one, as early as you can, map out a skeleton of what you think that story might look like, you know, a little introduction, where it comes from, one thought, and then some, you know, skeletal points that would sit underneath. And you don't necessarily have the detail at that early stage. And I think it's really fine to think, well, I think this is what the messaging should be. I think at this early stage, that's what the answer might be. This might be effective, but it's a hypothesis. It's not necessarily the full thing. And you might be just using phrases, not full sentences. So do that early just to anchor your thinking, right? And then you'll do some analysis. It might be that you just leave it in a drawer for a day or two, or go and do some other work for a while and then come back, so that, you know, your subconscious brain can do some work, which, why not? You know, if your brain can do some work for you without you consciously having to make it work, great. You know, do that, and then perhaps do your analysis and come in and start to fill in the gaps and fill in the detail and work out, you know, well, do we have material to fill in all of these gaps, all of these sections of the story that we think we need? If we don't, great, the skeleton can guide. We can go and get them perhaps and see if the information we find supports our idea or not. And so in that case, then we can sort of fill it from the bottom up and test and see whether those ideas align. So, you know, we would then revisit by looking at it top down and see if it all hangs together, and then look at the details and say, well, do these things really represent the high level messages? And you're sort of iterating between that top down, bottom up sort of the two different ways of thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think my experience has been, getting that single message as juicy as possible is really important, right? So just because it's a high level, it doesn't have to be vague and bland. In fact, it should.
It mustn't.
It can be very specific and juicy, right? And also at different levels, right? You know, you say, it can just be the message can be, was working with a finance CFO, and I was like, well, you can report on the numbers, you can report on the implications of the numbers, or you can report on the business impact or recommendations based on that, and that's playing a higher level.
Absolutely, yes. Bingo.
And then the other thing that I noticed is that so with this person trying to communicate with their chief executive, we're actually debriefing on a situation where it hadn't gone that well, and actually the chief executive pushed back with some like, where's the historic data? Like, let's look at the trend. And he was like, I couldn't understand why on earth he'd want to see the trend data.
And why did he want to see the trend data?
Well, so when we went back and we mapped out, like, let's just diagnose what would the communication strategy have been, like what actually is the key message, and then, well, what would your supporting points need to be to justify your key message? Then for me, it was pretty obviously that, like, you needed to show. His first point was, like, productivity is on track. Well, for it to be on track, you have to have a benchmark. So you have to look at historic data to see if it's on track. So
yes.
it kind of came out by doing this hard work, if you like, of the top-down thinking.
No, that's right. And look, there's some really great tools that you can use to help work that through as well. And one that all consultants use, which is, the reason all consultants talk about it, is that it's so incredibly powerful. And that's MECE, MECE, which stands for Mutually Exclusive, Collectively Exhaustive. Or if you were at some other consulting firms, it might be Mutually Exclusive, covers everything. Same acronym, same meaning. And sort of as a concept, you say, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, when I look at the communication, each idea is distinctly separate. There's no overlap. That's great. Covers everything, or collectively exhaustive. Okay, what does that mean? That's actually the hardest test of all, but that's where the top-down piece becomes really powerful, because you say, okay, how do I know if this covers everything? Well, basically, am I answering the right question? That's really the tool to use to work out whether you're covering everything. And that question that we pose at the start of our communication, so then we can answer it as a single sentence and then unpack it. That's a tool that's very sort of well, it's incredibly powerful to work out whether we've covered everything or not. Yeah, so I think, top down, bottom up, and just being really conscious of iterating between the two of them and doing a top down pass toward the end of the work. When you're sort of thinking, am I finished yet? Go top down and just check that everything hangs together and there are no gaps, that it is, the ideas are mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. And think about it as an idea, a set of ideas, not as a document. And I think that's very helpful in that process too.
I think that's right. I think playing with the ideas and getting clear on that, I guess it's my idea of strategic laziness. If you get the ideas right, you don't have to write that much. Better.
In fact, it's better. I worked with somebody this week, and they're in an audit team, and we were actually using something he'd done previously as an exercise, and he had a 5-page PowerPoint that he'd prepared, and we had a look at it, and we said, okay, well, let's just go back to first principles. Let's work through the process and see what we come up with and see how it compares, and then you can have reflect and see the difference. And we did this thing, and I said, okay, so we've got our story, and we've got one idea, and we've got 4 points underneath. So we need a title page and a background page, and we need one overarch our story, like a bit of an executive summary. And then we need a page for each of these sections. So 4 more pages. So that's seven pages. And he looked at it and he said, couldn't we just use the 1-pager that we built? Could we just not use that? Wouldn't that have done it? And I went, actually, I think that'd be really better. I think that'd be great. I just assumed you wanted charts and things to go with. And he said, well, I don't think we need that. Do you? I said, no.
I think 1 page is fine. I think once you've got your thinking clear on 1 page, for me, it's actually much more powerful. You put the 1 page in front of the person and on the slide, and then you rely on your own personal credibility and knowledge to have a conversation. So it becomes more credible, and rather than just like, I'm going to bash you over the head with my huge slide deck.
Oh, absolutely. But also, I think it's credibility and confidence. I think the very fact that you've got your thinking on a page gives you the confidence, which then gives you the credibility. But also, there's no harm in having one or two charts with you just to support key points or call out. I think that's a really useful strategy. And the very first time I started working with this method, it's many years ago now, with a client in a retail organization, and we built some ideas, put them on a page, and she said, well, I'm going to take those. I've got a meeting with the CEO next week and I'll just sit down and talk them through with him. I think I'll just take the page with me. I thought, oh, great idea. And so she did, and sat down, and I remember I realized this is a podcast, so I'll have to describe what he did rather than, illustrate with my fingers. But she was sitting opposite a table with the CEO on the other side, and he literally just got her page and put his fingers on it and twiddled it around so that it was, they could both read it, if you like. So it was sort of sideways, and he just looked at it and could follow, and they were able to have a really great conversation because they just had that one piece of paper between them, and everything had a place. So I think working visually on a single page is really powerful when you're wanting to marry that top down and bottom up sort of thinking. And have the good conversation. Yeah, really
so
useful
I know
thing to do.
I know time is kind of ticking on. So is there anything else that you think would be important for us to kind of weave into today's discussion around top-down thinking?
I think I'd put one of my hobby horses out there, which is to focus on that one page, whether that one page is on a whiteboard, or you showed me one earlier that's on a Zoom whiteboard, where a storyline is built. Focus on getting that thinking architecture right, focusing on that architecture of the ideas. And once that's clear, then work out how you communicate it. Don't obsess about creating a document or a PowerPoint or filling a template or something like that. Obsess about getting the thinking right, and then work out what you need, because I think you'll need a document a lot less often than you might expect.
Perfect. Okay, so so I think it's been a really interesting discussion, right? Because we've looked at this power of top-down thinking, the way that it creates kind of perspective and direction for the whole communication, and actually helps us anticipate the needs of the other people, and then this idea of kind of pinging up and down between the details and the big picture to make sure that the two kind of come together, right? It can be tempting just to kind of start with all the massive details, but then hard to get up to the big point. But equally, you want to make sure that what you're saying is correct and that you can actually have the points that demonstrate that, and you're not trying to twist truth to fit what you're trying to say. So
exactly. No, that's right. And if I just by way of example, as a closing sort of example, when I was running a workshop recently, I asked everyone in the room what their problem was. Do they get stuck in the detail, or do they have trouble getting to the detail? And it seems to me people go one way or the other, just like you mentioned there. And I'd say 95% of people in the room were stuck in the detail, and maybe that's just because of the people I was working with. But those who were struggling, who could get that big picture quite quickly, really did struggle to get in the detail, and they were finding that very, very challenging. So it's a problem that does cut both ways, as we've said.
Yeah, and I think it depends, right? Because obviously, as CEOs, often a lot of CEOs, have mastered a lot of this, right? They've been able to kind of communicate effectively, which is where they've got to where they are. But I see often that doesn't always then apply when it's communicating with investors or major accounts. But also, if you think about the world of this of the CEO, often there are people who are great at their functional disciplines on the team who still haven't necessarily master that art of really getting to the point, so in executive team meetings. And I think creating that culture amongst your executive team is really important to be able to have proper conversations about ideas rather than spending your time wading through huge and long updates.
Huge and long decks. And look, that goes two ways again, too, if we're just bringing the hierarchy into it, where, if there's senior people who have that greater sense of perspective just by virtue of their position and their visibility in an organization, if they can set it up so that other people understand that bigger picture, then, the team can provide much, much better communication too, because they've hooked into that sense of perspective.
Perfect. Great. Well, let's leave it there. It's been a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to next time where we get into how to get the information that you need to prepare these kind of powerful pieces of communication. So that's going to be an interesting discussion, I'm sure.
Beautiful.
Thanks again, Dav.
Thank you, Richard. Great to talk to you.
And speak very soon. Bye now.
Okay, bye-bye. If you've been enjoying this series, you may like some more ideas that will help you communicate with impact, especially if you're dealing with complex material. My free course, How to Communicate with Impact, does just that. In this course, I cover 4 areas. How to get faster, more useful responses to your communication. Secondly, how your audiences really read your communication. Thirdly, how to communicate the right amount of detail. And finally, how to communicate powerful insights that cut through. So you can access this course by using this link, www.clarityfirstprogram.com/impact-podcast. I hope you find this useful and look forward to bringing more ideas to you through our upcoming podcasts. Thanks so much and bye for now.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Now let's talk about you. When you're in top leadership, when you're in the biggest role of your career, who supports you at a deep level as you lead others? Who helps you multiply your impact and get to the next level? If you're ready to learn more about our content, our coaching, and our community, then visit us at xquadrant.com.